Well, hello. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Sheri Kling, and on this Deeper Rhythm channel, I talk about how to listen for the deeper rhythm of your own life, mostly focusing on dreams, spirituality, and transformation. Now, if you like this content, please like, subscribe, and share it with others as much as you can. And when you subscribe, hit the little bell so that you get all the notifications. Now, there are links in the description below to register for upcoming events that I'm holding and to connect with me for one-on-one dream work. So I encourage you to check those out below. Now, today the topics we're exploring are trauma, brokenness, and wholeness. Now, I don't know about you, but I think American society is broken. And if you're watching this video from a country outside the US, hang in there with me because I think you'll find a lot of this discussion might interest you as well. So what do I mean when I say that American society is broken? Well, I think it's fragmented at all levels. At the broadest societal level, I think we can see that in our political polarization, in our racism, and in the ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. There is also evidence that we're broken at the interpersonal level. We see staggering levels of loneliness and broken relationships between individuals. And I think we're broken at what's also called the intrapersonal level, meaning our relationships with ourselves is so often split. And I think we see the evidence of that in the rising levels of alcoholism, drug addiction, and the amount of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications that we take. In fact, the National Center for Health Statistics showed that the rate of antidepressant use in the US among teens and adults increased by almost 400% between 1994 and 2008. Now, I'm going to give you a little preview of where I'm going to end up in this video. And that's something that I feel very strongly about is that we have lost the ability in this society to hold the paradox that every single human being is a complex person made up of both bad and good. Or as people in the church might say, we're all both saint and sinner. No one is all good, and no one is all bad, and no one is an unredeemable, deplorable, who should not be in our circle of concern no matter who they voted for. In fact, the only way that we will ever heal our divisions is if each of us does the hard work of looking at those parts of ourselves that we have buried in our shadows and finding out what they need, how they can be healed, and how we can bring all parts of ourselves into an integrated whole. Now that's at the person level. Of course, there's also societal work that has to be done to address the systemic systems of oppression in our society that are keeping people in poverty and in unwellness. But what I am talking here today about is that personal level. Now, another indicator of how split we are at this intrapersonal level was discovered in a study done in the late 1990s by Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventive Medicine in San Diego and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, which was called the ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Now, the ACEs study looked at the relationship between traumatic events in childhood or traumatic stress in childhood and adult medical and psychiatric disease, risky behaviors, healthcare costs, and life expectancy. And the findings of this study were stunning. The researchers wrote, quote, "It became evident that traumatic life experiences during childhood and adolescence were far more common than generally recognized, were complexly interrelated and were associated decades later in a strong and proportionate manner with outcomes important to medical practice, public health, and the social fabric of the nation. They go on to say, in the context of everyday medical practice, we came to recognize that the earliest years of infancy and childhood are not lost, but like a child's footprints in wet cement, are often lifelong. And when they talk about the social fabric of the nation, those are the kind of things that I'm also pointing to when I talk about fragmentation and brokenness. The social fabric of America is becoming completely unraveled at this point. And I think people on both the left and the right would agree with that. Now, in this ACEs study, 10 categories of adverse childhood experience were identified. Things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, drug or alcohol abuse in the house, domestic violence, and having an incarcerated parent. Participants in the study were given a numerical score based on the number of categories that they had experienced, so a score from 0 to 10. They found that only 1/3 of the 17,000 participants in the study had a score of 0. 1/3, only 1/3 had a score of 0. 1 in 6 had a score of 4 or more, and 1 in 9 had a score of 5 or more. Now, the researchers of this study found that high scores were directly correlated with higher incidences of a wide variety of risky behaviors and public health ills, including alcoholism, smoking and illicit drug use, depression and suicide attempts, and even chronic diseases like COPD, heart disease, and liver disease. What the study shows us very clearly is that childhood trauma can have far-reaching and long-lasting negative effects on adult health and behavior. Now, Jungian analyst Donald Kalshed connects this to dissociation, which he describes as when there is a psychological split that happens in the psyche of a child or adult who is facing an unbearable traumatic experience. Now, more recent ACEs studies done among different populations have added categories like poverty and peer-to-peer bullying to the categories of adverse childhood experience that affect adult health in negative ways. It's no wonder, then, that we are a mess in this country. If those numbers are true from the ACEs study in the 90s, then we might guess that something like 50 million of our citizens in the U.S. are being drastically affected by early childhood experience that was negative. Think about the effects of war on children living under constant threat of bombs and surrounded by combat every day of their lives. Think of the effects on children of living in the middle of constant gang violence. Now, before I go any further, let me say that if you have suffered trauma, or if you are currently living under traumatic conditions, please seek help from a professional counselor or through a domestic violence hotline or a support group like Alcoholics Anonymous. Don't suffer alone. There are people who will help you. There are people who will support you as you take the necessary steps to be safe. Now, I can't step into your lives out there and stop what may be happening for you. But what I can do is talk about my own journey from trauma to healing, and about how we can imagine the wholeness that is possible within this world that is so full of brokenness. And this is a spiritual matter. Now, here in the West, in Western society, the Western world, we live and operate within what I think is a faulty worldview, meaning that the story we tell ourselves and each other about how the world works does not actually reflect reality. For example, we have been told that the world is made up of solid stuff, of matter that has no value beyond what resources it can provide us. We've been told that mind and body are separate things that have no effect on each other, that there is no meaning in the world other than what we individually give to it, that there is no such thing as soul either in ourselves or in the world. And we have been told that mind is better than body, that reason is better than emotion, that power is better than relationship, that white people are better than people of color, and that men are better than women. But these stories that we tell ourselves or have been telling ourselves for centuries are wrong. They can't explain the way our minds and bodies interact, made very clear by the ACEs study, and other studies as well. They also can't explain the way life seems built out of purpose, or the meaning that comes with relationship, what it means to be in love. They can't explain the sense of wholeness that we sometimes glimpse underneath all of the brokenness of the world, even despite and within the brokenness of the world. These stories don't explain how we can often rise above our limiting or wounding experience and come up with amazingly creative solutions and the most beautiful art. They can't explain the wonder we feel when we look up at the stars in the night sky or at the birth of new life. And these stories don't reflect the interconnectedness of everything within every ecosystem in the natural world. And they certainly don't reflect what some of the new sciences have shown us, whether it's in ecology or quantum physics, about the nature of the world. Now, our world can't help but feel broken at times because it is made up of real individuals with real agency who make choices in their own best interests. And those interests sometimes compete with other interests. We live in a world that is always in the process of becoming, meaning it is always creating and always perishing at the same time. Things are dying and being born all the time. Being embodied also means being finite, having limits. And those limits mean that everything is inherently imperfect. So, what is the wholeness we can seek in the midst of the brokenness of the world? First of all, it is not perfection. One of the worst translations of a biblical verse we can find is Matthew 5, verse 48 from the Christian Testament, when it's translated as, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Now, blogger Bryce Haymond tells us that the Greek word translated as perfect in this verse is teleios, which also means fullness, completeness, or wholeness. When we translate the word as perfect, then we think that means we must become perfect beings who never make any mistakes. But we can never become perfect because we are limited, and limited things will only and always be imperfect. In fact, gloriously imperfect. Haymond writes, and I'm quoting him here, "I perceive that Jesus meant for us to recognize within ourselves the wholeness that is ever present in our essence, in our original creation as a manifestation of God, a Son of God, an offspring of the divine, an incarnation of God. Deep in our basic nature, our original identity, our original blessing, our original wholeness, at one with reality, with the cosmos, with our source, our Father, the One. This exists prior to the emergence of the dualistic ego self in our mind, this constructed sense of self that is seemingly apart from all others. Now he goes on to say that the paradox of our reality is that the sacred source of everything manifests itself within all the brokenness, multiplicity, and imperfection of this cosmos. Now, Ernest Kurtz and Catherine Ketchum, in their wonderful book, The Spirituality of Imperfection, talk about a spirituality that speaks to both the inevitability of pain and the possibility of healing within the pain. They also talk about the essential imperfection, the basic and inherent flaws of being human, the errors that are just part of the game. They write, "We are not everything, but neither are we nothing. Spirituality is discovered in that space between paradoxes' extremes. For there we confront our helplessness and powerlessness, our woundedness." When life is looked at in this way, then, wholeness is not about reaching some state of perfection where everything is exactly as we want it to be. Wholeness is about being at home in the world despite its flaws and brokenness, and it's about living creatively within that imperfect world. It's about seeing ourselves and our suffering as part of the greater suffering that all humans experience, and about listening and watching for the deep joy and contentment that can come even in the midst of that suffering. Now, theologian John Cobb describes wholeness as at-homeness, and writes that whole people are at home in their bodies, in their conscious and unconscious feelings and senses, in their human relationships, and in their total natural environment. They are at home with who they are, and therefore they are comfortable being just that. Because they are at home in themselves, they are free from defensiveness toward others. Others experience their warmth, that is, their openness, their concern, and their affection. One is not the object of good deeds or just treatment from the whole person. One is the recipient of acceptance and understanding. Now, Carl Jung talked about how we need, not only as Jesus taught, to love our outer enemies, but we must also love what he calls the poorest of all beggars, the most impudent of all offenders, the very enemy himself, and see that these are within me, and that I myself stand in the need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved. Now, we can only be at home in the world. We can only be whole when we are willing to love what is wounded and traumatized, or weak and vulnerable, or even hateful and argumentative within us. Because every one of us is all of those things. Yes, we are also creative and capable of being very loving and beautiful, but none of us is only rainbows and unicorns. And none of us is only bad or only racist or only abusive. In fact, many of us who act most violently or abusive toward others are the most wounded and fearful inside. Even the most virulent narcissists actually believe in their heart of hearts that they are worthless, which they certainly don't show the world, but that's the truth underneath what they show. But each and every one of us, I believe, can be redeemed, can be transformed, can be made whole. So as we enter this holiday season, I hope that each of you can meet the divine child seeking to be born within you, even in the midst of the muck and brokenness of this amazing world. Now, if you'd like to dive deeper with me into an exploration of how I have met hidden characters, both positive and negative, in my inner basement, then click on the link below to get to my on-demand video library to watch Meeting Our Shadow in the Basement. Also below is a link to register for one of my upcoming Dream Divina contemplative dream workshops, and to reach out to me if you're interested in one-on-one dream work to discover more about your dreams and your spiritual journey and transformation. You can also find a link to become a patron of this channel and of my work, which I greatly appreciate. So until next time, may your dreams be fruitful and your journey be joyful.